All right, so now that we have a better understanding of what the color wheel actually is, let's talk a little bit more about a couple more technical things before we get into actually constructing and understanding palettes. So I mentioned hue, saturation, and value sort of in passing, but I wanted to explain what that means in like a deeper context. So hue is everything you see on the color wheel, right? That's your pure color. If you were to go to the store and buy a tube of like cadmium red or ultramarine blue, and whatever comes out of that tube, that's your pure color, that's your hue. The saturation, value, and brightness are all equated to what we would call tint, tone, and shade. I am so sorry, I miswrote something. This should be shade. So tint, tone, and shade. What that means in practice is basically how much white, gray, or black that you add to a color. So if you have this pure color, like this looks like just yellow right out of the tube, that's your hue. If you add white to it, you get a tint. If you add gray to it, like a very neutral gray, you get a tone. If you add pure black, you'll get a shade. Now, what that means in relative to saturation and value and brightness is your saturation is going to be your tone. So that's on a scale from pure gray to the pure color. That is your saturation. Your value or brightness is the scale from white to black. Now, we can kind of see that in action in this color picker menu. So I'm going to just go ahead and get a quick snip of this so I can kind of label out the axes. Now this is something that I recommend you mess around with on your own to figure out exactly what this is going to look like. But for the most part, this right here on the side, that is your hue. So that encompasses your entire color wheel. You're going from red to yellow to green to cyan to blue to magenta and back around again to red. So that is hue. Oh, that's not the best way to write it, is it? Hue. And now this is a grid of saturation and value. So right here at the very top, that is full saturation. So if we went all the way up to this far corner of our color picker, that's going to give us an incredibly pure red. Now, if we go all the way over here, that's going to give us pure white, and anywhere along the bottom is going to give us pure black. My apologies. So, what that is then is this axis right here is your value axis. So that's the scale from white to black, and this axis right here is saturation. Now, some color pickers have all of these things on the same thing, and they're usually a wheel with value represented in the middle, and then kind of going outwards in hue. But I just prefer this one. It's kind of easier for me to understand personally, and it's, again, something I recommend you mess around with to kind of understand what this is going to look like in practice. But basically, think of it like a graph, with your x-axis being value from black to white, and then your y-axis being saturation from gray to full color. Now, technically on this side of the axis, the right-hand side, that's still full saturation, but because you're adding black, you're making it a shade. And if you go along the top, you're tinting it and adding to the pure color with white. So your shade is going to look something like, still using pure red, it's going to look something like this. And your tint is going to look something like this. The tone gets a little bit more complicated because if we just sort of drag it, if we call this pure gray right here in the center and this full saturation, if you just imagine a line from here to here, somewhere along that line is going to be your tone. So, a very easy way of understanding this would be simply to mess around with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take these that I just made, and then I'm going to just select a couple of other random colors. And this is mostly just for demonstration purposes. I want you to kind of get a feel for how this works, and I recommend like grabbing a random image or doing what I'm doing and just throwing some swatches down. And then I want you to hit Control U, and that's going to bring up your Hue and Saturation menu. Now, what this does is it allows you to tweak those values on sliders. So it'll be a plus or minus 180, just because that's how integer values work in the computer. So sliding this is going to just mess with your hue, and again, that is your placement on the color wheel. So you can see this is about opposite here. So the reds have all turned to greens, whereas my, like, I believe this was a, yeah, this like magenta here has turned to like a yellow. But you can see how this, just by dragging this slowly across the slider, it is dramatically changing all of these colors, because that's what Hue does. It's the pure color that you would get out of a paint tube. Now saturation, you can see as I drag this down more towards gray, all of these colors start to become just black and white. So pretty soon they're all just shades of gray. And if I drag it all the way up to full saturation, these will start to look a lot more like something you would just get out of a tube. Now you can see that like my tint and tone are not really changing all that much because they were already at full saturation, but these other ones start to look a lot more like fully saturated colors. You can see when I did that, it jumped up from like here to here. So we're going to have to go ahead and put 0 back, and you can see this is the original, and this is what it looks like at full saturation. So like my tone here went from this like kind of gray to a pure saturation. Now lightness, this is another word for like value or brightness. So in a lot of programs you will see lightness, value, and brightness used sort of interchangeably, and while they have technically different definitions, for all intents and purposes, just think of them as the same thing. So we drag our lightness down, or our value, you can see they will all turn to black. And then as we drag it to the other side, you can see how they all drift into white until they completely disappear. Another fun thing about this menu is this bar at the bottom reflects what your changes are doing, while the one on top represents like color wheels, like the actual slider. So you can see this is a lot darker, a lot less saturated, and then like our purples are lining up with what reds originally were. So hopefully that will explain all of the different fields that you get in a color picker like this one. This LAB, don't worry about that. That's another one. I don't want to confuse you completely though. Same with the hex codes. That's just something that the computer generates based on the red, green, and blue values. So the ones that you actively manipulate while doing art, and like you should be thinking about while doing color as well, are just the hue, saturation, and value, and then also just where it is on the color wheel. And once again, all of these are based off of like traditional paint mixing that you would do with like physical paints. So these are all vocabulary that you would use in a traditional art class as well, although slightly different, but the exact same concept. Okay. In the next video, we're going to talk about actual like color schemes and how they can be applied.